Hey everybody, Brant Frost again. Hope y'all are doing well. Back with David Pietrusza, author of 1936, FDR's Landslide and the Triumph of the Liberal Ideal. And we're talking about his book, which you can get at all good booksellers, including his website, davidpietrusza.com. And I would like to begin by this interview by asking David to tell us a bit more, as we've talked about in previous interviews, tell us a bit more about the stakes in 1936, because you have Roosevelt fighting the people like Dr. Townsend with his proto Social Security plan and Huey Long with his share our wealth plan. He's fighting them from the left. He's fighting big business and the DuPont family and these other interests from the right who are opposing the New Deal. And then the Republicans put up this almost blank slate, this blank canvas against him, that anyone can kind of paint what they want onto him in the form of Governor Alf Landon of Kansas. So tell us about how all this comes together and how Roosevelt, how he comes up with this plan, this campaign strategy to win 46 out of 48 states.
Well, the strategy is in place largely with the New Deal, and recovery, relief, and reform, and you have some degree of recovery because you've still got 13-14% unemployment in November 1936, which sounds like a pretty pathetic recovery, certainly not robust, but it is the best figure on unemployment since 1931. So people say, okay, I got a job now. I didn't have a job then, and maybe things are better. And you've got tens of millions of people on relief or government employment, federal employment at this point. And they are, beholden to the New Deal. Gallup takes a poll in the spring of 1936 and says like 77% of people on relief are going to vote for the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt. So as they say, you can't shoot Santa Claus. And so the big plan is really the New Deal. After that, it's kind of frosting on the cake. And that frosting involves a class warfare situation or strategy by Franklin Roosevelt, and where he starts in December 1935 with a real blistering attack on all the business interests that might have questions about the New Deal. And that continues into the famous speech where he accepts the nomination in Philadelphia at the Democratic Convention, where we remember the phrase rendezvous with destiny, but the phrase he really liked was the economic royalists. And so he's telling these little parables and funny little stories about how these men in silk hats were begging for help, and then they were just attacking him afterwards and were such ingrates because he saved capitalism, et cetera, et cetera. And he continues this all the way through the campaign. So and who does he aim his fire at? It's not the populists. He's not using the rhetoric against them. It's against these silk-hatted guys of the American Liberty League, these rightward Democrats who are very wealthy who are opposing him, and also against William Randolph Hearst, a very controversial figure. Even before Citizen Kane, he'd been controversial the whole century up to that point. And so he makes a lemonade out of a lemon, because he wanted Hearst's support. He had it in 1932. He didn't have a lot of press report and newspaper support. He was crying poverty on this issue and saying, "Oh, all the newspapers are against me." In fact, Alf Landon had the smallest percentage of the newspapers backing him than any of the four guys who did run against Franklin Roosevelt. Hoover, Wilkie, Dewey, Landon. So he's not even holding the normal Republican vote in the press room there. But Roosevelt goes against the Liberty League. He goes against Hearst, and pick your spots and pick your enemies and see how is that going to resonate with the voters.
Roosevelt was very successful. Multiple, you write about this at using WPA and other New Deal projects in certain areas, certain states he needed to win, but even at a congressional district level, not just say in the state of Indiana, but in certain districts within Indiana where there was a district which had been Republican in the past, had elected a Democrat in 32 or 34. And then he puts a project out there. And then the chairman of the Democratic National Committee, Jim Farley, makes sure that he tells all his Democrat Party guys, all the WPA directors who are all good Democrats, he tells them to tell their workers, remember, to tell them right before election day, a day or two before. Remember, fellas, if the president's not reelected, this program goes away. So didn't Harold Ickes describe it as tax and tax, spend and spend, elect and elect?
I think that was Henry Morgenthau.
Oh yeah, Henry Morgenthau.
That was later on. Roosevelt pours money into Kansas. Just you see the amount of relief money going into Kansas right towards the end of the 1936 campaign. He means to crush Landon like a fly, boom, in his home state, and the amount of money which is going into the Western infrastructure, like irrigation projects, very, very high. So
was that why he flipped? Was that why Roosevelt did so well in the Midwest, in the Plain States in the West in the second time? Because that's something that I'd like you to talk about as well. Up until 1932, the Democratic Party had never won. The last time the Democrats had won a majority of the national popular vote was 1852 with Franklin Pierce. It had been 70 years. The last time they had won a majority of the vote as large, anywhere close to what Roosevelt did in 32, was in 1828 with Andrew Jackson. But the 32 thing can be written off as a Depression mirage. But how did Roosevelt take an unprecedented, I think, 57% of the vote, and then parlay that 4 years later, hold all of it, add on 4% to get to 61 or almost 61%, and pull away areas which have been Republican for almost their entire statehood existence, the Rocky Mountains, the Plains states, the Pacific Northwest? How does he do that and build this New Deal coalition which held for the next 30 years?
Well, add the to that Southern New England, which is starting to shake loose from the Republican Party with Al Smith, where Smith carries very heavily Catholic Rhode Island and Massachusetts.
It's the Catholic immigration over the previous decades
exactly.
is the reason Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts.
Right. Yeah. And so from about 1900 on, when Roosevelt is carrying 75% of the Catholic vote in 36 and 90% of the Jewish vote, well, then he's got a good chunk of the Northeast and even the Midwestern states where large immigrant or ethnic populations in states like Michigan and Illinois, Wisconsin, which had been a progressive Republican state. It takes a while for it to become Democratic, but it's a populist progressive sort of state. Now, what Roosevelt is able to do is to start shifting the progressive Republicans into the Democratic Party. And this is his goal. He brings 3 Republicans into his cabinet to start with. He funnels money often through pliant Republicans, progressive Republicans, through Hiram Johnson in California. And in New York City, he always had a problem with the Tammany organization. Well, not always. When he had to work with them in the 1920s, he worked with them. You could see the program for the dedication of the new Tammany Hall in 1929, and Franklin Roosevelt is right there, happy as a clam. But then when things go bad for Tammany, he puts the hammer down them and on them. And he has to do that in 1932 because of the stink of corruption is just too much. And he has to remove Mayor Walker from the mayorship of City Hall in New York
Jimmy
City.
Walker, yes. They
But
made a movie about him,
they
about Jimmy
did with
Walker in the
Bob Hope.
50s. Yes,
And
that was a funny movie.
yeah, and uh, so when you've got all the demographics of the nation changing like that, and you've got the demographics of the nation changing from rural to urban, which officially that occurs back in 1920, it's a powerful formula for Roosevelt and his successors, and they're able to build on they're able to build on his reputation for decades and decades, and scare the hell out of voters for decades and decades that the Republicans are going to come in and take away Social Security. I mean, I've listened to that from a very good friend of mine every election year, and she's convinced that they're going to take away Social Security. And it's like, no, they're not. They're just not. And it's like Charlie Brown in the football, that a certain segment of the population falls for that every 2 years.
After, yes, we've seen throughout American history where politics doesn't necessarily, people don't necessarily change their politics as much as one generation passes and another, and their children or grandchildren vote differently, or they simply get overwhelmed by a new wave of immigration, such as in what happened in the Midwest during the 1840s and 50s. The Midwest used to be a solid Democrat region with the one or two exceptions, but Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, solid Democrat states, had never voted for the Whig Party. And then in 1856, Fremont wins every single one of those five Midwestern states, and then Lincoln wins them again in 1860, due largely to the wave of German immigration and Swedish and Scandinavian, which come in there. If I remember right, several of those Midwestern states had actually passed laws, states controlled this back then, had passed laws to say that you did not have to be a citizen in order to vote in state elections. And even though it didn't apply to federal, it was pretty hard to regulate that. So the German vote was crucial in several Midwestern states for the Republicans back in the day. It wasn't so much that the old Virginia migration into the Midwest changed their mind, they just got outvoted. But I'd like you to tell me more about, I'd like you to tell just a bit more about.
With that German population coming in, remember why they're coming in. Unlike, say, Poles or Russians or Jews or Sicilians, it's not like they're fleeing from really horrible economies. They're fleeing, at least after that 1848 revolution, for ideological and political reasons. And they're very liberal and they're very progressive. And so that you're going to see a real progressive strain to the Republican Party in a lot of those states, like in Minnesota or Wisconsin, particularly Wisconsin, once La Follette takes things over around 1900.
That is rather ironic that the godfather of progressivism in the state of Wisconsin, a state that's mostly German, was a Frenchman.
Yes.
La Follette. Rather ironic considering the history between the Germans and the French. But we know demographic changes in the Northeast, as you've said, and lower New England were significant in Democrat success and moving it from Republican to Democrat. But the far West hadn't seen as much demographic transformation over the previous decades. The Plain States and the Rocky Mountains. Was it Roosevelt's? Was it the relief, the WPA, the rural electrification, the rural bringing water to those areas? Was that? I think
it's all those big projects. And recall that in the 1948 election, there's a document which is the blueprint for Harry Truman's campaign strategy, and it's supposed to be written by Clark Clifford. It's actually written by somebody else who actually hates Clark Clifford, or Clifford hates him, so he can't put his name on it, and it becomes the Clifford document. And it says you don't worry about the West, Harry. you've got the West because the West is so dependent on federal projects. It's sparsely populated still, and actually still is, except for the Pacific coast. And they are very grateful and dependent on these things, and they are not going to turn away from the Democratic Party. So that's a big part of it. I saw an interesting stat. I was listening to, I didn't see it, I heard it. It was a video on YouTube, and it was a series on Jewish history in Europe and America. And the one episode was in about America, and it was talking about the demographics in California. And in the 19th century, they were saying that the population of San Francisco was 10% Jewish, and that it was next to New York, had the second highest population of Jews in the country, which when you say that can't be right, but evidently it was. And it probably, affected their population and their culture as well. I don't know how much in terms of our conversation here, but it's a factoid I had never heard of or been aware of.
Oh, yes. And yet you also have to remember that, like you say, the West was very sparsely populated. So an investment, a relatively inexpensive investment in those states would yield significant dividends, because the combined population in those days of Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, the combined population of those states was less than the population of Indiana, or just barely larger than Indiana. So you could get the equivalent, same population, but that's you have upwards of 20 senators worth of states in those far western states. And it's true even today, as you say, that after you get past Dallas, you draw on a straight line through the up down from Canada to the Mexican border. After you get west of Dallas, other than Phoenix and Los Angeles and Las Vegas, it's not till you get to the Pacific coast that you have any really big population centers.
Yeah, there's another video it just put out.
Salt Lake would be the other one. Other than Salt Lake, the triangle of something like a triangle, Salt Lake to Phoenix to Vegas. If you take those three cities out, you've got very small populations between them.
Even to this point, it's an 80-20 split. Imagine what it was in 1936.
Oh, yes. And this Arizona in those days had just one congressman. One of the reasons being that the Southwest is so incredibly hot that before electrification, the Hoover Dam, and air conditioning, you just couldn't live down there. Before water could be brought in and before AC was developed, nobody wanted to live there in large numbers. And it's one of these days, maybe we'll talk about Barry Goldwater and how he grew up on what really was a frontier state, even though he was born in 1908. The Arizona of 1908 wasn't all that different from the Arizona of 1888 or 1878.
No, I'm sure it was still a very much of a frontier. But again, what starts to change it is, the Hoover Dam, and which Franklin Roosevelt renames the Boulder Dam, and talk about an act of spite. But the damming and the irrigation from the Colorado River impacts not only Nevada and Arizona, but a good part of Southern California to this day.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Absolutely. Absolutely true. And you talk about in 1948, you talk about how Truman builds off what the Roosevelt campaign had done in 36 and 40 and 44. And you've written a book about 1948. You've written a book about 1960, the 1960 election, 1920 election, 1932. So you've covered this 40-year period in 5 different books, all excellent volumes. In 1948, of course, is the iconic election where Harry Truman is counted out by virtually everyone. All the pollsters say he's going to lose. And it probably, would you say that other than 2016 with the surprise election of Donald Trump, has there ever been another election where the consensus among the pundits and the pollsters seemed to be so much in error as in 1948? Was there ever another election that was such a surprise?
I mean, yeah, we talk about in 1936, the Literary Digest getting it so wrong. They start polling all the pundits right at the end of the election. And even the more conservative or Republican ones are just like, basically taking the Fifth Amendment on who they think is going to win. Not going to go there. Nope, not going to say. And that the other polls, whether it was the Gallup poll, the Crosley poll, the Roper poll, that the people who I guess still poll for TV and radio ratings, the Nielsen people, they were hired by the Republicans to do these private polls, and they were showing it at the one where instance where I have seen the data that Roosevelt was ahead 50-33 over Landon. So that actually it was the outlier of the Literary Digest at the end of the game. But with Truman, yeah, it's just about everybody is given up Harry Truman for dead, and has been for a while. Truman had his ups and downs. Truman is, now we're seeing the ups and downs for Biden, where he's going like a roller coaster up and down. And Truman was doing that up to and after the 1948 election. And his lowest point before the 48 election is nowhere near the lowest point he has in like 1952 or so, where he's registering 23%. 23% is bad. And he could have run for he could have run for a renomination, and he could have won for the presidency again. I think he actually gets beat in the New Hampshire primary by Estes Kefauver, the senator from Tennessee, who was running the big anti-crime. Estes Kefauver is the real first television politician. We completely forget who this guy is, but he was very popular at one time. He beats Truman. He beats Adlai Stevenson in the 1956 primaries, but he's not liked in Washington and among the establishment of the Democratic Party. He never gets nominated. But, Harry Truman would have been crushed in 1952 if he had run again, even though he could, because he was not affected by the amendment, which was limited presidents to 2 terms.
Exactly. And of course, 1952 was the year that the two men that you write about 1960. Well, really, it was an iconic year for all three men. The 1960, the year of 3 presidents. Your excellent book about that election. 1952 is a pivotal year in the careers of Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, because 1952 is when Kennedy goes to the Senate.
Yes.
Nixon becomes vice president, and Johnson becomes majority leader in November, December of 52, minority leader, Democrat minority leader in the Senate, majority leader 2 years later, because Ernest McFarland
of Arizona
is defeated thanks to the coattails of Eisenhower bringing in this department store owner from Phoenix into the Senate named Barry Goldwater. It's funny. It's not until right now.
And Arizona had been a solidly Democratic.
Yep, solid Democrat. It's funny. Not until this moment did I make that connection. Lyndon Johnson owed his, in many ways, owed his presidency, because without being majority leader, he never would have become vice president. Owed his presidency in a way to Barry Goldwater.
What an ingrate!
Yeah, and he would return that by slandering Goldwater in '64 and smashing him to bits in the election that year. But 1952, go to 1960. Was 1960 your first book, or was it 1920?
1920. Then we moved into 60. I've been jumping around. Then to 48, and then to 32, and then to 36. In between 48 and 32. No, after 32, I did TR's Last War, which was about the final years of Theodore Roosevelt, which is kind of like about 1916.
It is. It is. That's a very good book to get. And your book, you have very good titles for those books you wrote. Very interesting. Year of Three Presidents, 1960. But 1920, you really did good when you had the year of six presidents. And people are thinking, six presidents? Well, tell the folks who those six presidents were, because
Oh,
it
I
is
get
true
it.
that six presidents
Yeah.
were in that.
And one of them has an asterisk. But so starting in chronological order of how they served the presidency is Theodore Roosevelt. And it's like, no, he died in 1919. Yes, I know that. I can read Wikipedia too. Okay. And I've been doing this presidential thing for a long time, so I know. But if he is not dead, he is the nominee of, as sick as he was, he would have been the nominee of the Republican Party because they were just desperate to get back into power. And the American people by 1920 were desperate to get rid of the Democratic Party. And so he would have been elected. You would have had a very progressive Roosevelt 12 years ahead of schedule at that point. He was giving off vibes that, no, these old guard Republicans may like me, but I'm still the old radical TR of 1912. But
if he had managed to make it, to live another couple of years to become president, do you think it's likely that, like Warren Harding, who ended up being elected, he might have died in office?
He would have died in office if I don't think he had
Fairly
that much
soon?
life in him to any extent. But
And what would have been
here's the
ironic
real
is,
irony
I'm
is
sorry.
let's skip ahead. Let's skip ahead of the next guy chronologically.
Because that would be Wilson.
Yeah,
That was the next.
let's ditch him for a couple
Yes.
minutes and talk about Warren Harding and TR. Because as much as they opposed each other in 1912 and 1910, even they met and they got along really nicely, like around 1918 or so. And particularly when Harding puts forward a bill where TR could lead his Rough Riders into the Western Front in France, which is like, yeah, right, that was going to happen. It didn't happen.
Was it a division? Was it a regiment or division? Did he introduce a bill to make the whole division?
Keep those things straight, but it was a bad idea, and it was Woodrow Wilson was not going to do it anyway. But it sure made points with TR, and I think had TR lived, you could have very well have seen a TR Warren Harding ticket, which would have been interesting because both of those guys would have died before 1924.
Exactly.
They just weren't well. Although maybe Harding would have lasted a little while longer because he wouldn't have had the pressure of the presidency bearing down on him and the scandals and it's a hard job. It's a hard job.
Very ironic. It would have been very ironic because if Harding had become president, if Roosevelt dies in 1922, 23, Harding becomes president, is reelected in 1924, but dies the following year, the year after that, and is succeeded by a likely candidate for vice president, potentially Herbert Hoover.
He probably would have picked Hoover.
You'd have entirely skipped over a president, the next president. You had first your six presidents: Roosevelt, Wilson, Harding. Then your fourth president in the year of six presidents, who is, of course,
Calvin Coolidge. Now, Calvin Coolidge was governor of Massachusetts in 1919. There's a wave of strikes nationwide. The vaudeville actors are going out on strikes, the telephone operators, not to mention like steel and the big industries and things like that. But the Boston police go out, and he issues the statement, to Samuel Gompers, who wants to reinstate them after the strike collapses. And what the strike does is there's lawlessness, there's looting in the streets. The police have defunded themselves. Okay. Yeah. And the Coolidge says, no, you've deserted your post. You guys can't come back. This is too much. You done wrong.
didn't Coolidge say, wasn't his quote, famous quote that was carried around newspapers around the country, was there is no right to
That's
strike
right.
against the public safety?
Anytime, any place, anywhere. And that resonates with the public. There's a boomlet to make him the nominee. He doesn't support it. He realizes he's got to be like a dark horse, and he's realistic. But then the unrealistic things happens, and after Harding is nominated on the 10th ballot, the guys in the back room say, well, we need a Midwesterner, another Midwesterner. We need a progressive sort of guy like Senator Irvine Lenroot of Wisconsin to be the VP nominee choice. And as the nominations are in order, the seconding motions, a guy stands up, Wallace McCammon, a judge from Oregon. They think he's going to nominate Lenroot, and he says Coolidge, and the crowd goes wild, and it's completely stampedes the convention, which is pretty much unprecedented. Coolidge doesn't want the nomination, but he's a good party man, and he takes it, becomes president on the death of Harding. But jumping back to Woodrow Wilson, people may say, well, he wasn't involved in 1920. He was a sick man. He had that stroke. He was bedridden in the White House. His wife was running the country. So he wasn't involved. Yes, he was. He wouldn't step out of the way. And he actually sends his third and last Secretary of State, a guy named Bainbridge Colby, who shows up in the 1936 book as counsel to William Randolph Hearst, a member of the Liberty League, to San Francisco to the convention to try to stampede that convention into giving Woodrow Wilson a third term. And when this does not happen, and in fact, when Colby gets there, it's a secret mission. It's a secret mission, kiddies. And so the other cabinet secretaries don't know that Colby is there to do this. And when he tells them, they go, that is just sick. That's the worst idea we've ever seen. You should be ashamed of yourself. And Colby says, they made me feel like a criminal or something. But Wilson actually did try for the nomination. A guy who modestly tried for the nomination was Herbert Hoover. And he was a very popular guy then. He had gotten the American, first he
couldn't decide which party he wanted to run in.
Can't decide, but his story is he was an orphan boy and goes from Iowa to Oregon with 10 cents sewed in his pocket to live with his uncle, and then becomes a millionaire in the gold fields of Australia and China, and is a brilliant mining guy. And he's almost retired by the time World War I comes around the corner. And he's tasked, as they say nowadays, to get the Americans out of Europe because there's a war on, and guys and gals are stuck between the enemy lines. And let me just go off camera here.
All these great books that David's
back.
been talking about are available at davidpietrusza.com. And that's David, Pietrusza.com. And these and many other of his great books are available at davidpietrusza.com. I encourage you to take a look at it. We've got
this is my first prop of this series. And what you might be able to see,
we can see it, yes,
is it's a passport.
Wow.
It's a passport signed by William Jennings Bryan. And that is my great grandmother holding my grand uncle Leo. And they had gone over to Galicia in Austria-Hungary in 1914, which was a really bad move. And they got stuck behind enemy lines, or they got when the Russians started moving west, and they couldn't get out, and they had left without you didn't need a passport before the war. So they had to
People
get a
forget that.
passport
People
made
forget
up.
that. You didn't need
Yeah,
passports to
yeah.
travel before World War
And
One.
she needed one to get back through Germany and then to get back home. But I don't know whether she was aided. She may have been aided by Herbert Hoover, who got all those Americans out of Europe. And this was his first big splash with publicity and doing good and doing wonderful, actually. And then he feeds the people in Belgium who are stuck between behind German lines. He is the food administrator for Woodrow Wilson during the war.
After the war, he's credited with saving millions of lives from starvation. Isn't that
in
correct?
in Eastern Europe, in the what is not quite the Soviet Union then. They haven't changed the name to protect the guilty. And in the Middle East. So, and then he's Secretary of Commerce. But in 1920, he's sort of a Wilson guy, and he might be a Democrat running. He wins two primaries. He wins New Hampshire and he wins Michigan and he wins the Democratic primaries. But he loses the Republican primary in California because he's an internationalist and the isolationist United States Senator and power in the state. Hiram Johnson squashes him that year. Someone who wants him to run and says, you should run and I should run with you is Franklin Roosevelt. They had known each other. Roosevelt had admired Hoover then, thought he was great shakes, and would be just the man to save the Democratic Party in what promised to be a Republican red wave or whatever they called it back then.
Other than General Pershing, there was probably no other American in 1920 with such bipartisan appeal as Hoover.
No, I don't think so. Nope. I mean, maybe if you got Henry Ford to run or some big industrialist who had squashed strikes or something, he'd be the man with the $5 paycheck. Now,
exactly. If we had the time, we talk about Pershing. That's another amazing story. How a man wins a world war, comes home, and is a complete dud as a presidential candidate.
Absolutely. He just does. I think he was from Kansas or somewhere in the Midwest. He couldn't carry his own state in the primary.
He was born in Missouri. He entered the Nebraska primary. I think he allowed his name to go into the Nebraska primary. But he lost so badly that was the end of that.
Boom.
And I don't think there's ever been a general. It's funny. Admiral Dewey was the same way. He did not do too well when he considered running for president in 1904 after the Spanish-American War. Pershing had the same problem. It's amazing that General Leonard Wood, who had not been in France during the First World War, but was the inheritor of the TR machine, was still able to make a very strong bid for the presidency in 1920. But you have Hoover, you have Coolidge, Harding, Roosevelt, Wilson, that's five. And of course, the man you just mentioned, who we've talked about in 1936, Franklin Roosevelt, is Undersecretary
of the Navy, and is an ambitious guy even then. There's been
he ran for Senate, didn't he? In 1914.
He ran for Senate in 1914 when he was still on the outs with Tammany Hall. They put up the fellow who is going to become the ambassador to Germany, James W. Girard, and Girard just crushes Roosevelt. And Roosevelt kind of goes back to his office in Washington, bides his time, and is nominated for vice president in 1920.
Because of his sterling qualities as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and nothing to do with the fact that his last name is Roosevelt.
Well, yeah, that had a lot to do with it, and also because Cox was an outsider. He was not connected to the Wilson administration, so the boys in the back room still wanted to make nice with the Wilson administration because they'd been sort of, McAdoo hadn't gotten it, and none of the other guys who were running.
That's the president's son-in-law, William Gibbs McAdoo.
And
Harding is considered the president elected by the backroom deal, the smoke-filled room. But the 1920 Democrat convention was a lot more divided and a lot more backroom deals being made than the Republicans.
Much more. One of the commentators says, the difference is it wasn't wasn't a smoke-filled room in the back in the back room. It was right out in the open with cops. And also it's
Yes,
right out in
indeed.
the open with picking Franklin Roosevelt, where it was the machine politicians from Chicago, Indiana, and New York who really got together and said, this
True.
Roosevelt guy is the type of guy we need to balance this ticket. And part of that was also the strategy of Tammany was, let's get rid of him. Let's get him out of New York State, which was the same strategy that the Republican bosses of New York had in 1900 with Theodore Roosevelt. And
Exactly.
that didn't work out either
No,
because,
no, 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 it
McKinley
didn't.
was shot, and then that damn cowboy was in the White House, as Mark Hanna said.
Exactly, exactly. And of course, the your fifth book you've written about presidential election 1932, of course, talks about Roosevelt and Hoover, and carries us forward to 12 years. And of course, the other great, great. I say that in great terms of not a great man, but an influential man who rose in Europe in 1932 as well. The other warlord, so to speak, who with whom Roosevelt would cross swords at the end of the decade, who came to power in 1932 in Germany, Adolf Hitler. So in that you have your excellent book 1932, which in some ways I think is your best book ever, because there's so many amazing figures in there, and you cover both sides of the Atlantic. It's one thing to write about an American election, but you not only write about that, but about the politics of Central Europe and what's happening in Germany in a parallel form. And it's just such a great story. I encourage everyone to get that. But before you buy any other books, you've got to buy 1936, FDR's Landslide and the Triumph of the Liberal Ideal by David Pietrusza, who's been so generous with his time with us today. And I'll give you the last few minutes to share anything you care to share. And thank you again for giving us this time.
Well, nothing really to share, but thank you for having me on.
Thank you, sir. Thank y'all. We'll talk to y'all soon. God bless.